Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to the Occult Explorers. I'm your hostess, Snappy, and as always, I'm joined by my good pal, Dion. How's it going, Dion?
Hey, glad to be here.
Right? This is going to be a crazy fun episode because, Mormon history, it's so new and radical, and it's so close to home here. And I feel like a lot of people aren't truly aware just how intense and radical some of this Mormon stuff gets. Like, it is doing the deep dive into this episode. It's been just so incredibly shocking, revelation after revelation. So before we get digging in deep, I want to give our little disclaimer. As always, right, we are not, academics. We are not approaching this as academics. We are exploring religious ideas and culture, and we're going to be talking about our, ideas on this stuff and what's kind of going on in and around this. We're more doing this from an anthropological perspective, right?
Oh,
And
yeah.
we want people to keep that in mind because, with Mormonism, a lot of people are still are active believers. This is such a very current and powerful and important thing that's happening in our world going on today. And it's also really interesting for us because, like, a lot of the best scholarship is happening now, right? Like, this is such a new field in terms of religious studies and getting really into the more intense elements of it. Like, you can go right now and search on YouTube and go watch videos by Dan Vogel, who's one of the leading Mormon historians. You can search out Bryce Blakenagel and you can watch his podcast, Naked Mormonism, which will take you like almost week by week through the history of Joseph Smith. And that guy also did an amazing paper and lecture series on entheogenic use in Mormonism as well. So, we're kind of right now on the cusp of all this study, and it's been so rewarding. So, with all that being said, what have you been finding, Dion? And what's your thoughts on all this?
Well, first of all, I'm glad that you said some of those authors' names like Dan Vogel and the rest of the crew, because a lot of the information, some of it does come from them.
Yeah.
Just to let you know, there's about 10 different authors, and some of them are excommunicated or Mormons that left the church.
Yeah.
And others are just researchers from the outside. And also, we also got to give our normal trigger warning. We might talk about drugs, body fluids, religions. In this one, we might talk about genocides. So,
right. And we also, with the Mormons, we're going to be talking a lot of sexual abuse, like and genocide. So these are two of the most intense things. So, I know a lot of people take these warnings for granted, but we got to be real here about the Mormons. This is some of the darkest of American history, and it gets dark, right?
Yeah. In my introduction to them was as a child. I already told you about my weird childhood, and I did study with the Jehovah's Witnesses, but before that was Mormons. The Mormons used to come to the house, and it was me that they talked to. And they were young gentlemen. They'd come on bicycles, wearing suits, two blonde-haired youths from Utah, and they would sit in the living room, and they would tell me about Joseph Smith and Jesus, and did this for a while. And they were trying to, my family was crazy, they were there for me to try to, to save me from the ghetto.
So what was your perspective on all of that? Like, how did it resonate with you at that time with the person you were then?
I was a little kid, and I would go to the different churches, to the Catholic, to the different ones, because my family was all wild. So I would hang out with my friends and go with them to church. And also in California, there's Deseret Industries, and I have a connection to it another way, that I started studying the Partridge family and the relationship with California seances and Mormonism. So with that, let's go to the first picture.
Right. I did want to just talk, I'll talk a little bit too about my experience, because it's interesting you brought it up, because when I was younger, right, and I've told this to people a bunch, I was heavily invested for a long time in evangelical Christianity. And I got really kind of love bombed and got really good at it as a young person. I was obsessed. Like, I read the Bible through, and I could recite stuff at people. So when Mormons would come around, I made it a mission and would like try to like put these young 18-year-old boys in their place. And I'm the same age, right? And it was ridiculous. I remember having these guys over to my house and just like telling them stuff that they had no idea about. And then being like, oh, it's on the Book of Mormon website, because the pastors at my church would fill us with all of this like anti-Mormon propaganda in order to attack these kids with. It's like, in hindsight, I thought I was being smart, but really I was just approaching it from another ideological asshole perspective,
The irony,
Right?
you said a key word. You guys were kids,
Yeah.
or young adults. And that's what Joseph was.
Right.
Because of the knowledge we're talking about, we see him as one of these older types. This story with him starts as a little kid. And you see this picture right there. And it doesn't even start with him. It starts with his father, Smith Sr., and their connection to Solomonic magic and Masonry and Quakerism. And this is in New York. And one thing he had a fascination with is digging. He's a digger. And you could catch Joseph Smith's father on any given night out on the side of a mountain or a mound digging for treasures. And he would recite Solomonic prayers and draw sigils. And if they didn't find the treasure, that was because the spirit had moved the treasure from them. You know?
This is an ongoing trope, and it's really important that we highlight this. Like, the Smiths are coming out of two magical traditions. One, you have the general folk European magic tradition, which isn't very codified. But at the same time, he's clearly operating within that Solomonic magic lens. Like, I look here at this picture that you've posted, and this is a sigil to Jupiter. This is how, as someone who was doing Solomonic magic, this is one of the things necessary in order to, what you said, talk to one of these treasure spirits. Because often you need to summon these spirits to show you where the treasure is. And then they're tricksters. They'll hide the treasure, or they'll move it. I know later on, Joseph Smith, like, this becomes super contested, because in the earliest versions of when he finds the plates, they actually talk about him seeing the spirit of a toad who makes a weird noise at him. And then the plates slip out, like they fall through the ground and get hidden. Like, they were deep into this stuff.
Oh, definitely. The treasure could move.
Right.
And if you did the incantation wrong or drew the sigil wrong, and the father was obsessed with it. And part of it, he was trying to get Captain Kidd's treasure.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, Captain Kidd's treasure he'd heard about. Also, he was looking for Native American treasures. And people say treasure, but I haven't heard many people say, it's only a few authors that posit that he was a gravedigger.
Oh,
because we know that when you're digging up King Tut's tomb, that's not a gravedigger getting all those treasures.
Right.
Graves is where the treasures are. And so that's part of it. And that's why he looked for mounds, because they understood that the Native Americans had a special relationship with America. And they didn't just see them as these rustic, dumbasses. They saw them as the inheritors of some ancient knowledge, even though they thought they're better than them, which we'll learn later. But part of this process for digging, I can tell you, is these stones. If we can go to the next picture, and then you could tell us what you have to say there.
Yeah. There's so much kind of, all these magical stones and stuff. There was just two things I wanted to bring up. I remember going through some of the journals we have of Smith Sr. And Joseph Smith Sr. actually describes, after talking to an indigenous friend, going out into the woods and stumbling and getting lost and finding like a magic plant. And then he talks about consuming this plant and having visions. And there's a huge debate about what this plant could have been. But like this, we're trying to just set the scene here, right? So Joseph Smith Sr., okay, he's engaged in communication with the indigenous people, and he's practicing indigenous folk magic. He's also somewhat connected to the Masons and may have been a Freemason himself. And as you showed in the previous slide, he's clearly practicing Solomonic magic. One of the items he actually passes down to his eldest son, Hiram Smith, that we still have is an actual, like a thame, a sacrificial knife inscribed with the sigil to Mars. And this would have been used like in the Grimoire Verum. These sacrificial knives for Mars were used to slit the necks of black sheep, you know? So it gets so deep here, right? But yeah, keep going, Dion.
Well, just so you know, those knives come up later in the endowment ceremony. But
right.
So part of treasure hunting is you got to get you a seer stone. That's one of the key elements. And we talk about stones in our previous episodes. The meteorite stones, the Shiva lingas. There's a lot of stones we talk about.
Oh, yeah.
And it could be tektite. They could be obsidian. They could be wood. They could be all. What is that? Not calcified, but when things over time harden. They could take any type of element. And so the stone on the left and the stone on the right, they think were actual stones that were passed down to Joseph Smith. So about this time, Hiram, his older brother, and the dad are out there treasure hunting, and they never find nothing. They never find something, and they're actually going broke over it. And then finally, Joseph Jr., he takes to the treasure hunting game, and they start taking him out, and they train him. And supposedly, they start getting lucky with it. And the seeing stone on the right is called a peering stone. And he would look through the stone, and he would stare at these stones, and would help him to locate the treasure. Well, what treasures are they locating? Well, they're locating missing farm animals, missing tools for other people. And they would conveniently know where these items were. He would stare at the stone and say, "Oh, well, your missing tool is over there behind that tree over there." And they would pay him off for it.
What's so interesting, and one of the things that Mormon apologists love to ignore, and we have a history of this. There are laws in the books to stop these kind of charlatans. This is a well-known scam. And this scam, it's a confidence scam. But the idea would be, you claim to have a magic seer stone. You claim to be able to have visions of hidden treasure in these mounds, which are clearly ancient mounds, right? So there's already an assumption that there's stuff going to be there. Then what you do is you go to the site prior to anyone being there, and you hide coins or ancient artifacts or interesting stones in and around the mound. Then you go and you tell someone about it, and you convince them to come and start digging. When they inevitably find the stuff you placed, you convince these guys to start a mining company or a treasure hunting company. And you get you get them to go and get all their friends involved, and you sell shares. And each of you gets money in the shares. And then the way the scheme would work is the guy who originally started the stuff would run off with the money and leave the people with the shares and never show up for the second part of the dig, you know? And people made these accusations of Smith. We have written affidavits from people who said that Smith would plant stuff, that he had spies, the whole freaking nine. And this is the thing, is that Joseph Smith, like you said, he took it to, his dad was notoriously unsuccessful, was considered a lazy lout, was not successful as a farmer, not successful as a treasure digger. Smith comes into the game, all of a sudden things start to rack it up. And it's not like they're making large, but they're able to convince people to go on digs. Smith famously gets people to actually start companies, to go out and dig up sides of these hills and stuff, right? And he works with other famous charlatans like Samuel Lawrence, which is going to come up later, I know, so I'll hold off here.
No, talk about Samuel, because people got to know.
Right.
Joseph, it's between 24 to 38. I think it's a 14-year period that he does this whole run. He's so young. I didn't know how young everybody was until I started studying this. I'm like, wow, they're like in their 20s.
Right.
And they're setting up shop. They're having wars with the federal government. They're interpreting the Egyptian artifacts. They're contacting spirits. He started off young.
Oh, yeah.
And, that's part of it. And let's go to the next picture.
But yeah, so like with the Samuel Lawrence character, this is another notorious treasure digger. This is someone who actually gets arrested and charged for this. Okay, so Smith famously gets charged with, well, it's weird. He gets charged with the accusations are really weird, but they're of the time. But famously, it never fully goes to trial. They're supposed to re-go to the trial, and for some reason, it doesn't continue to happen. But Smith was even charged with being a fraud, ripping people off for treasure digging. But this Samuel T. Lawrence guy, who was a close personal associate of Smith, was actually charged, and he stayed in the area of Palmyra, never became a Mormon. And he continued to hustle people throughout the rest of his life, largely, until he moved away and then he died. But the crazy thing with Samuel Lawrence is they were competing people who were involved in the same treasure digging company, who were both lying about what they saw in the mound, okay? Famously, Samuel Lawrence lies and says he sees giants. And specifically, he sees inside the mound magic seeing glasses, okay? Now, this is something that kind of fucks with, excuse my language, but messes with all of Smith's narrative, because Smith uses a seer stone. But now all of a sudden there are magic seeing eyeglasses that he corroborates. Like, he claims he can also see them too. So he has to incorporate these seeing eyeglasses into his mythology. But it doesn't really work for him, He has his old shtick where he puts his magic rock into his hat and he sees via the magic rock. He doesn't want to have to use Samuel Lawrence's stuff, but he was vouching and lying with Samuel, so he has to maintain this lie, to the point where later on, when they're trying to compile all of the how the actual document was written and compiled, there are conflicting testimony. All of the earliest testimony talks about the magic seer stone. But then later testimony that's been redacted by Smith talks about him behind a curtain and wearing magic seeing eyeglasses, But that's clearly later, and it's clearly inspired by this Samuel Lawrence guy. So, wild stuff.
Well, at a certain point, Joseph is successful. He's digging, and he finds some gold Egyptian plates. And an angel shows up and talks to him and tells him, "Hey, you're the prophet. You're the new one. You've been chosen." It's all come true. Here's a representation of that young Mormon study.
Right.
With the angel Moroni showing up. Let's hit the next picture.
Again, what's interesting about this is that in the earliest accounts that Smith gives and people closest to Smith give, it's not an angel that shows up. It is a toad spirit. So some weird stuff going on, right?
Got a little UFO.
Exactly. He's clearly operating in this folk treasure hunting milieu in the beginning of his career that then he has to distance himself from, because it's not, mainstream, and it's seen as fraudulent, right?
Well, here's these plates, copper plates, supposedly, that they found. Some people will say gold, copper, bronze, and
I just say this. I remember back in my evangelical days, one of the things they used to tell us is like, do you know how heavy gold is? If he had all that on thin plates of gold, it'd weigh like 2,000 pounds, and he never would have been able to lift it out of no mound by himself. So
they'd be delicate if it was gold,
right?
So let's hit the next picture.
Oh, and another thing too is like when Smith was first told about where to go and find the plates, he was first told by the spirit he had to wait a year, and he had to return with his older brother Alvin. Now this gets complicated because in that year, Alvin dies, right? Well. And then now he has to, because he told everyone he needs a special person with him, he has to find that special person. And the first person he turns to is Samuel T. Lawrence, which is where these glasses come in. But later on, he redacts it and says, no. Samuel is a fraud, and he's actually not the one supposed to fill in for Alvin. Like, it's such insane stuff.
Here's a representation of some of these magical glasses. You ever seen the movie National Treasure?
Yeah.
And they have the little glasses?
Yeah.
Based on these Mormon glasses, viewing glasses. Because Yeah, he eventually had to say, well, the angel brought me glasses to help me interpret the plates.
Yeah.
Through my magic glasses. And I could see other things that you can't see. And I could also read the language, interpret this Egyptian writing, a form of Egyptian writing that he said. But hit the next picture.
Right. It gets so wild.
And here is an example of what you were talking about. On the right, he would stare into the hat. He put the stone and stare into the hat in one of the versions, and he would identify some kind of treasure that he had previously buried there, and he'd wait and plant something over it so that it would look natural. And on the left, there's the magic glasses that were the Lawrence's glasses, and he could interpret the plates with those.
Right. And this is where it's so interesting, because for the longest time, the mainstream way that the Mormon church would share this story to their followers is the picture on the left here with the glasses. But the earliest accounts from the people closest to Smith, those who were translating the text directly, like Martin Harris and Emma Smith, his wife, all describe it as the second picture, as him looking in his hat with his special seer stone. And there's even this story with Martin Harris where he talks about how at one point he steals Smith's stone and swaps it for a similar looking stone. And then Smith goes, "Oh, what has happened? I can't see anything. Did something change?" And then he goes, "See, this proves that you're not a charlatan, because, you do need that stone." But I'm just thinking, if Smith is spending all this time staring at that stone, right? And we saw that picture. It's a stone with very specific whorls. He's wearing it in a pouch over his heart. He knows what that stone looks like. You're not swapping it out for anything. That doesn't say anything.
Right.
It's so jokes.
Well, at this point, he's successful. He has the plates. He's a prophet. He has an angel. He has a book of teachings. And some people he just take those teachings outright from somebody else. He becomes a Mason. Where he goes, he fast tracks. Supposedly he fast tracks, which pisses off some other Masons in the area. But at a certain point, he's successful, and he gets his followers.
Well, this is really important, though. Before we jump ahead, there's a couple things I want to talk about. So, one, there's the whole story where how Smith gets his wife Emma is by defrauding her father Isaac and starting one of these treasure digging companies where they claim that they can find all of these treasures. And one of the things he tells Isaac is that at first he believes him, right? The idea to Isaac of someone looking into a hat with a stone wasn't too much. But then when they start digging, the treasure magically sinks underground. That is when it starts to get too much, especially when Smith comes out and says they have to sacrifice a black sheep, And then, famously, Isaac never approved of the marriage of Emma and Joseph. He was vehemently against it his whole life. And Emma actually ran away with Smith and went against her family's wishes, and this, her story is a wild story. And if you ever get a chance to read any of her biographies, I highly recommend it, because, she is not a victim, but she is definitely victimized. And it's a sad story of the horrors of what love can do to you, falling in love with a monster like Joseph Smith, right? But with the Masonic stuff, where it gets really interesting and wild is that we have to remember that at this time in America, there's this whole political fight against Masonry. And Masonry is a hot topic. Masonry is seen as this progressive insiders boys club, right? That has this maintaining this secret kind of underground system that only benefits the few, right? That caters to their whole kind of worldview, and is also pushing for these progressive ideas of equality. Okay. Now, to Smith's world, these things are radical, extremely radical and dangerous. So on one hand, while Smith is very interested in masonry. He likes a lot of the structure of it and the magic of it. He's also extraordinarily anti-Masonic. And if you read the Book of Mormon, it reads like a totally anti-Masonic kind of thing. Like it has all these prophecies about the future of America and how people need to watch and look for secret ciphers, right? It talks about how there's these secret societies within the various tribes that are fighting, that what sparks the war, you know? And famously, Martin Harris, one of the transcribers of the Book of Mormon, calls the Book of Mormon the anti-Masonic Bible. Now, why this is wild is because what you just said before this, right? I just set up that he's this extraordinarily anti-Masonic person, yet he gets invested, becomes a Freemason, sets up his own Masonic temple, and starts making people master Masons. And we know that many of the early Mormon rituals are just straight rip off from Masonry, you know, down to the hand signatures and everything. Like, it's wild.
100%. 100%. So much so that they start having wars. You can look this up. You can type in the word Mormon wars and which one? Like we have World War I, World War II, World War III. They had a whole bunch of these Mormon wars. They get kicked out of New York, kicked out of Ohio, kicked out of Missouri. Then they go to Illinois. You've heard of Nauvoo. You know, and they're getting in fights. Everywhere they go, they're having wars with the government, wars with people over Masonry, over a new form of Christianity, over, what do we call it, polygamy?
Yeah.
Was that the term they called it? They didn't, I don't think they, what was the other word they have for it?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember.
Plural wives.
Plural wives, yeah. But we got to understand the reason why the whole thing of plural wives becomes so convoluted and is because this was kept within the upper echelons of Mormon society. It was only for the most trusted Mormons, and it was mostly only for those who were Danites and who were elite. You know, especially we also see like a transformation of Smith's, you know, polygamy, whereas in the earliest times it's kind of him just hooking up and with random women that he would meet and manipulate into having sex with them. And then later on, he's doing these sacred marriage ceremonies with other men's wives and stuff. You know, it gets, you know, it's a progress. And it's the same thing with a lot of this Mormon stuff that happens, like the anti-Masonry and the very kind of communal way that they were living in the early days pushes them out of New York, you know? But by the time they wind up in Missouri is where things start to get absolutely insane, because this is where Smith tries to start his own town. He incorporates his own secret military/police force called the Danites. You know, he's trying to influence the local politics. He actually calls for the assassination of the, you know, of the governor of Missouri, Wilford Boggs. Like it gets so insane. Like people forget, like Smith called himself and saw himself as the American Muhammad. He was trying to establish a theocracy with himself at the head. He talks about rallying the Native Americans and freeing the slaves in order to do this. You know, he tried to run for presidency. Like, people don't understand just how intense this guy freaking was, you know?
And imagine this is between the ages of 24 to 38. He's a young guy. And one of the ones he wanted to print his own money up too.
Oh, yeah.
That was one of the things. Now you said Native Americans. You know, if you could hit the next picture, because part of his proselytizing, look at he would go to the natives. You know, and before I even tell you what happened with the natives, I want to tell you about the native herbs that he learned from them. And so at a certain point, he has these temples in Missouri, Illinois, Ohio. And they eventually passed something called the temperance movement, which is to ban alcohol, because he was incorporating alcohols, but he was also incorporating various plants and herbs, because he tells them, don't worry, we still got our plants and herbs. And some of these were wild lettuce. In the Mormon tea, you had henbane, nightshade, mandrake. We've heard even opium. I don't know how they had the opium there, the California poppy. Anything he could get his hands on. Apparently, he really liked it. And there was a gentleman from a newspaper that infiltrated one of their Mormon meetings and was going to join. And he said it was wild. It was like an agape love feast, psychedelic and sexual. And people speaking in tongues.
Right, I've heard a lot of this stuff, and I really highly recommend everyone go check out Bryce Blakenagel has a really good lecture on this, as well as an article that they released talking about the possibility of these oils, these anointing oils that they were using in these rituals being psychedelic. And he talks about at one point where Smith is administering these oils to an older gentleman who has a freak out. You know, he has like a psychedelic break and starts like freaking out and almost has a heart attack and almost dies, right? And after this point, Smith is in a panic mode and he starts to hide a lot of these rituals. And again, they become only for the elders and for the bishops, you know. They have all of these titles and secret societies and stuff, you know. It gets really interesting. But before we go on, I want to talk a little bit about, we have to understand, I should have mentioned some of this earlier, but we have to understand kind of how a lot of the early Americans thought about Native Americans at this time. You know, there's that whole idea of the mound builder mythology that existed prior to Smith that he's kind of incorporating. Smith is not making this stuff up. He's kind of taking what is already existing in New England and tailoring it to his own ends. You know, so there's already this ongoing, and this is like widely accepted within the academic institutions of the time, but the ongoing understanding is that the current indigenous peoples were not the ones who built the mounds. They were not the ones who built the Aztec temples. They weren't the ones who built the Peruvian stuff. None of these great monuments could have been made by brown people. And a lot of the popular conception, they believed that there was an earlier group of white people who had crossed over the strait and had built all these civilizations, and then they were later destroyed by the current indigenous people. You know, and a lot of this has to do with this puritanical ideology, right? Like, we have to understand that the early Puritans, right, they're not just Christian and Protestant, and they don't just view this, like, they view their salvation as one done through works, okay? And they see their salvation and their work as intrinsically related to the idea of progress and intrinsically related to civilization. So when they look at the indigenous people, they see, for lack of a better word, primitive people, people who are abandoning civilization. And then when they don't adopt civilization and they don't adopt Puritan culture, the Puritans see this as like the worst thing. They say these are satanic people, these are evil people, you know. In order to be saved under the Puritans, it wasn't enough to be Christian. You also had to be civilized, right?
Well, you know, there's a term, Joseph thought that they were the remnant of Israel.
Yeah, he did.
The rites that they call either the Lamanites or Labanites. And he was trying to convert them and telling them, hey, you guys are special. I'm the prophet here to tell you guys are special people. And they're like, F off.
Right. But again, this comes out of like when I was studying religion studies in university, we looked into this is not something that was directly done by the British per se, in that they wrote it down and were like, this is how we're enacting this. But everywhere they went, where they colonized, what we see is a mythology that starts to come about, where the new colonizing people displace the indigenous people. And one of the ways that they justify this displacement and their stealing of the land is to excise the people from their land, to remove their indigeneity, right? To say that they do not have ties or ownership or any connection to the land. And they do this, the British do this everywhere. So famously, like you just said, the Native Americans are now the lost tribes of Israel. They don't have connection to the land. When I was studying in India, they used this with the Indian peoples. They said they were divided either into the Tamil South Indians, who are actually from some magical island called Lemuria, not even from Sri Lanka or India. They're from some sunken island. Therefore, we can steal the southern lands. And these northern Indian peoples are actually from the Caucasus Mountains, and they're not from India. Therefore, we can steal their land. It's an ongoing kind of cultural trope, right?
Well, it gets deep because at a certain point, he tries to tell everyone that Jesus had came to America originally,
right,
to speak to the Indians. And part of that, they had something called Cumorah Hill ceremony or pageant in New York. If you want to hit the next picture. And up until last year, it was banned. And at this ceremony, Mormons would come from all around the United States to New York, and they would camp out, and they would recreate Joseph Smith talking to the Indians and Jesus coming to the Indians to speak to them originally. And it's a whole wild trip. It's like a Broadway musical based with Native Americanism, Egyptology, Christianity, Masonry. It's very wild.
If people are looking for a really fun time, there's a podcast by, again, Bryce Blakenagel, where he reads the Book of Mormon verbatim. And you need someone to read that text for you because it's so poorly written and it's so repetitive that it's like, but if you can persist and listen through, there are some wild, crazy gems in there that are worth checking out. And like you said, right, it's this whole narrative that Jesus Christ came to the Native Americans, and that there's this ongoing battle between light-skinned Native Americans and dark-skinned Native Americans. And it's, and there's all this weird Masonic stuff in there. And yeah, it's wild.
Hit the next picture. And here's an actual scene from their pageant where the Jesus is there to save the Native Americans. And it's like a mixture of ancient Israel, like I said, Masonry, Native Americans, Egyptology, Mormonism, and it's all put together in this pageant. Like I said, it was banned last year. But there's also something that's a darker side, the relationship with the Native Americans. It's kind of like a genocide.
Yeah,
and if the natives were already genocide to begin with years earlier, but wherever Joseph would go, they would take him out.
Yeah. Well, this is something we see with a lot of these extremist type religious movements, right? Especially the ones that put an emphasis on saving. It's kind of ironic in a sense, but the Mormons were so heavily invested in recruiting the Native Americans when the vast majority of the natives reject them.
They kill them.
Exactly. This puts a huge burr in Smith, right? He resents them to a point that is almost unimaginable. And it really picks off with his successor. Like, if Smith is a sexist racist, then Brigham Young is a monster of beyond epic proportions.
Well, it's wild that you said Muhammad, that he considered himself Muhammad, because that's what Muhammad would do. You either accept or die.
Exactly. Put you to the sword, right?
Hit the next picture.
And that is Smith talking about himself, okay? He is the one talking about himself as the American Muhammad. This is not slander.
Right. So at a certain point, he dies. He's in jail. The mob comes to get him and his brother. They want to kill him, take him out. They're done with them. It's been too many problems in all these different states.
Well, what happens is he sets up his little kingdom fiefdom, like you mentioned, in Nauvoo. And things start to take a wild turn because Smith starts to hook up with some notoriously horrible, shady people like John C. Bennett, And John C. Bennett was a shyster, a politician, a serial rapist and philanderer, a bootlegger, and him and Smith became best buddies. And within a few short months, Um, he became one of Smith's most trusted men in the upper echelons of the Mormon movement. But things get problematic because he was too much of an ass. He starts attacking elder wives. He starts going after people he shouldn't go after. He starts being too blatant about it in the public in Nauvoo. And he starts forming his own sort of cult of personality in opposition to Smith. So then a war between Smith and him sorts of breaks out. And it's this massive thing that causes all of this division that eventually leads to his ending. But the biggest thing with Smith, the biggest reason why his whole empire falls apart, is because he becomes a serial philanderer. He starts attacking everyone around him. He starts attacking the wives and children of his closest confidants. Like the one that blew my mind, that really set in just how much of a monster Smith becomes, is his closest confidant in the earliest era of the Mormon times is this guy, Sidney Rigdon. And Sidney Rigdon was a major church leader in his own right who converted to Mormonism and brought thousands of followers with him. And it's highly debatable whether Mormonism would have survived had it even not been for Rigdon, because Rigdon was a preacher. Smith had this interpersonal charisma and this way of convincing people to believe and love him. But he was not an orator in the traditional sense, whereas Rigdon was. He was that firebrand preacher. In fact, he's largely responsible for the Mormon Wars with this firebrand preaching later on. But by the time of Nauvoo, Rigdon is ill and is kind of falling on to the wayside in Mormon politics. He's no longer that active. And his daughter is coming of age. And famously, Smith tries to rape her. He actually locks her in a room and tries to assault her, and she has to fight her way out, and he tries to shame her into all this stuff. Like, it's absolutely insane. Smith just starts going after he wants to be a god king. He wants to be able to do whatever he can to whomever he can. And Nauvoo is where it gets right debaucherous. And the final straw is him appointing all of these masons to these master mason positions and giving away all these secrets, where eventually he gets arrested and thrown in jail, but it's not like a proper jail. And local masons rally up a mob and they break into the building and they shoot him, shoot him and his brother. And he famously, there's even accusations he's doing Masonic signs as he's trying to jump out the window as he gets shot. It's quite wild.
Well, you were talking about Rigdon. That's him on the right there. And on the left, we have Brigham. And if you notice, you see his little emblem he's wearing. It's a Masonic emblem right there on Brigham on the left side. They airbrushed that out. If you go to LDS pictures, it's airbrushed out.
Love it. Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah. And so obviously when someone dies, there's a power vacuum. And these two gentlemen started fighting over this said church. And they're called the Rigdonites on the right because he was the oldest elder. He was actually older than all these upstarts who are like 20s and 30s. He's like, well, I'm the elder. I should take over.
Right.
And Brigham was cutthroat. Brigham wasn't having it.
Well, this is where it gets interesting. It's because we have to understand that there is a huge divide between the early Mormon ideology and then the later Mormon ideology, right? Like we talked about how the early Book of Mormon is described as being extraordinarily anti-Masonic, right? By its earliest people like Martin Harris, and Sidney Rigdon is one of the early adopters of Mormonism. And he brings with him his own ideas on the Bible. And specifically, Rigdon is really all about the sanctity of marriage, this idea of one man with one wife, And this is a huge point of contention as things go on within the church, to the point where you get a division, a political division, because Smith is a philanderer, and there's no doubt in my mind that Rigdon is aware of the philandering. But by the time of Nauvoo, when Rigdon is getting ill and he's no longer in the upper echelons, and the Danites are now the most powerful force in the Mormon elite, and Brigham Young has made himself the right-hand man to Smith for dealing with Becket, and all this other stuff, there's this whole secret cult of polygamy that Rigdon is not even aware of. He's not even privy to, and his Puritanism, to a certain extent, has made it so that he can't even see it. But it's not just Rigdon. There are thousands of Mormons who believe in this, who don't see what Smith is doing, who are not privy because they're not part of these upper echelons of elders, bishops, and Danites. And it's important that people understand that polygamy was not open in Nauvoo.
And also, he has something called the Qumran, or the 12 apostles, which he took from the Bible, and he had his different people. Let's see the next picture. So Brigham, at this point, takes over. He's the one that's going to take over. And at that point, they got to leave the East Coast. They know that. The government's just out to get them. People don't like them. And so part of them get on steamliners, steamships, and they go to California. Because that's where New Zion was going to be. Was in California, not in Utah in the desert. But Brigham, in the meantime, takes everyone else and goes out to the Utah desert. And they get the idea for something called Deseret, which means bee to them in the Mormon Bible. This plaque right here is at the Washington Monument.
Wow.
It's set up there. And if you could hit the next picture, and I'll really break down what they thought they were up to.
So before we move on, I just want to talk a little bit about that divide, because it's not like the other like when I say a divide, like we now think of the mainstream LDS church as like the definitive Mormons, but at this time after Smith's death, we weren't sure where things were going to go, and three camps sort of emerge. Okay, four camps. You have the Rigdonites. Okay, you have the people who side with Emma Smith and Joseph Smith's youngest son, who they want to inherit the title of prophet when he comes of age. And it's wild is that if you read these early writings, even of Brigham Young, all of the elders are talking about how, oh yeah, when the next Smith comes of age, he will be made the senior prophet. But later on, they all drop that rhetoric, and no one goes back to Nauvoo to make that guy the senior prophet. But what ends up happening is Emma starts her own church in Nauvoo. She stays in Nauvoo. She remarries, and the church she starts is the RLDS church. Rigdon moves on. He doesn't get a very large following because he's so ill and old at this time. But this is where it gets super interesting, and what I'm super interested in is this guy, James L. Strang. So Strang is a Mason, and he kind of comes into the scene at the very tail end of Smith's life, like a few months before he dies. He moves to Nauvoo. He converts to Mormonism. He's a Masonic, like he's a Mason in his own right. He becomes really good friends with Bennett, and he quickly ascends the ranks and becomes really close to Smith as one of these upper elders. Now, this guy is one of the most interesting and brilliant people in Mormon history because he manages to come out of nowhere and secure an extraordinary amount of power for himself. He exploits this whole divide. He produces a writ that he claims was written by Joseph Smith that says that he is to be made the new prophet of Mormonism. And then he claims that he has his own magic plates that he found on his farmstead. And on top of this, he hooks up with John C. Bennett and gets Bennett to join him. And what's wild about this is Bennett is the serial rapist, the guy going around abusing all these women out in public. Strang identifies himself and his version of Mormons as the ones who love the sanctity of marriage. Yet they get Bennett to come join them and be their big spokesman. It's so freaking weird. And they hook up for a while and they go on their own exodus where they leave Nauvoo and they eventually come up to the Great Lakes, to Lake Superior, and they settle on Beaver Island, okay? Which is really near where I live, actually. This is wild. And Bennett for a while stays with Strang. They actually start their own secret society called the Order of the Illuminati. And there's all this talk about them wanting to invade governments, and none of it really comes to anything because, of course, Bennett is a serial rapist and an abuser, and he eventually gets kicked out of Strang's church as well. And I'm sure he was trying to manipulate power in Strang's version. But Strang is such a crazy guy. Him and his Mormons on Beaver Island, they live in like a communal, almost like similar to some of the other types of Mennonites you see in the Americas. But what's wild about them is they start declaring anyone who's not a Strangite Mormon as like okay, as fair game. You see some of this talk in Illinois among the Mormons and in Nauvoo about who is fair game to be ripped off and stuff. But it really comes to a head with the Strangites, where they actually form pirate bands and go raiding up and down the Great Lakes into Canada, killing Canadians and stealing stuff and bringing them back to Beaver Island. Like, freaking wild. Mormon pirates.
Lesties and kleptos.
Right?
Clear example. Well, Brigham does make it to Utah.
Right.
He gets his people there and takes out the Indians that are there in this unhospitable place. Let's hit the next picture.
And yeah, Strang winds up dying, and his group still survives to this day, actually, but they're extraordinarily small.
So that's the United States of America. That red area right there is what Brigham wanted. Initially, he's like, this is just the beginning. This is Deseret right there. That was going to be his own nation, its own state, Deseret, country, Deseret, based on the Beehive. And that was a Mormon colony.
Wow.
That's what it looked like. And they wanted it bigger, but finally, at a certain point, they're fighting with the American government. It was Buchanan was the president at that time, and it was just too much because they would take out the governors wherever they're at, like you were talking about earlier. Wherever they went, there was intrigue.
Right.
There was a story about what newspaper, their printing press, they printed something bad about the Mormons. They went and burned down the newspaper. They would have these different wars. And so at this time, I want to introduce, you could see on the picture there. So they made their way across from New York and made their way there. And some of these different states they had problems in. Well, there was another contingent that got on boats and went to California because that's where they originally were going to set up this new Zion, not in the middle of the Utah desert. It was going to be in California. Wow. And the man that went out there and that was part of it, his name was Samuel Brannan. Let's hit the next picture.
Yeah, it's also important to talk about at this time too, to understand some of how the Mormons were gaining followers and were doing all of this in America. Like, they were also doing a ton of proselytizing in the UK. And Brigham Young, part of the reason why he became so powerful within the Mormon movement is he set up this system where they could get people for dirt cheap. They could get them to America, and then they would help them come to the Mormon settlements. So they were constantly bolstering their membership with new immigrants and with new people. And some of these people wanted to be Mormons. Some of them were just doing it for the immigration, like the cheap way to get a boat ride here. But either way, it brought tens of thousands of people to Brigham Young that he could sell stuff to, that he could incorporate. And this is where his power really takes off, is because once they start to set up Utah, that's where he makes most of his money, is off of selling supplies to all these people going out to California to settle into all these other places.
Oh, yeah. And so,
go ahead here.
So here's the gentleman that goes out to California, and where he goes to San Francisco. And this dude was the richest dude at the time in California, the first California millionaire, Sam Brannan. And he made his money off of selling the supplies to the gold rush, to the people on the gold rush. He's the man they claim that started the gold rush by talking about it.
Yep.
And he made so much money, it was equivalent to like $30,000 a day in our time, is how much he was making. And Brigham found out about this, and he wasn't getting his tithes. He was upset. And so he sent, emissary out there to try to get the money. And it's a famous quote right here. I don't know if you could read that for me, what it says, what he said to Brigham Young.
For sure. It says, "You go back and tell Brigham Young that I'll give up the Lord's money when he sends me a receipt signed by the Lord." Ooh,
So he wasn't
ballsy.
afraid of Brigham, but Samuel had another problem. So he went up and down by the Sacramento and the Yukon River. They were going to set up this Mormon colony in perfect weather, not in the Utah desert, and in California. But the gold rush sidetracked and Deseret in the wars with Buchanan and the American government, things were boiling up at that point. So let's hit the next picture, and we'll explain why California tanked as the capital of Mormonism, New Zion. It's because of this woman right here, Lola Montez, the Spanish dancer. You heard that song, "What Lola Wants, Lola Gets"? It's from a movie. It's a famous song. Well, they inspired it from her. She was a Spanish dancer in San Francisco.
I've never heard of this. Okay, what's this? This sounds
and she's
wild.
Irish. She's not Spanish. She's an Irish gypsy woman that came, and she was kicked out of different countries. And she's with what's it? I think Bavaria, the king of Bavaria, Wilhelm. I think he gave her own arms and nobility and titles. She was a mistress to many famous people around the world.
Oh, wow.
And she would do her tarantella, her spider dance. Well, Samuel Brannan, the dude who wasn't afraid of Brigham Young, who told him to kiss his ass, and was the richest man in the West Coast, met her on a boat, and it fell apart. He was on a boat, and that steamliner, and his wife ended up divorcing him over this and took half the money and tanked all this New Zion that was going to happen there. And so,
amazing. I love it.
And you've heard what Lola wants, Lola gets. And we'll do episodes on her in the future because she's very famous. She would do her dance and just enthrall them all in Chinatown in San Francisco.
And
San Francisco was founded by the Franciscans, the Franciscan order. So there's a lot of esoteric stuff happening here in California that we're barely going to start to get into right now. But what you have to say?
I was just going to say, you talking about her, you know how much I love Lady Babylon type figures. And this screams a Lady Babylon type figure. She's a party woman who's traveling the world and destroying horrible religious bigots. I love it. I got to know more.
What Lola wants, Lola gets.
Definitely need an episode on her.
But she died in her mid-30s from syphilis, the naughty girl she was. And she would talk shit to people. Even on stage, they kicked her off stage because she would start talking to the hecklers so harsh. Like, women didn't talk that way back then. And she would say wild things and get naked and do her dances. And the rich men would go wild. And so at this time, they send this gentleman on the left out there to collect the money. And we're going to talk about this gentleman, who he is. You said that they went to the UK, and that was part of the success of Mormonism. It was because this gentleman right here, he did that. This guy, he met Joseph when he was 20 and joined the crew and was really into it. Joseph liked him. So much so, he's known as the 13th apostle because he joined his 12 apostles.
Oh, so this is Lyman. Okay.
Yeah, this is Lyman. This is Amasa Mason Lyman.
Wow.
His family names is Mason and Lyman. And he joined and was a good guy. People liked him. Orson Pratt got demoted from the 12 apostles. And so he was brought in. When Orson Pratt came back, they had to demote him. So he became known as the 13th apostle, but they gave him a position was called assistant to the presidency. And people were worried about that because he would have been next in line to take over the Mormon church after Joseph Smith.
Ooh.
So much so that the lady on the right, Eliza Maria Partridge, married him. That's Joseph Smith's wife, who married Amasa when he died. And, you know, her father was the first bishop in this new church. And this is a whole nother section. Yeah, the people are going to not tell you about this part of it because they have a whole different take on it. When he was in the UK, he did a sermon that was published in the Scottish newspaper. They got him in trouble, Brigham, a year later when they saw it, because he was saying, you don't need Jesus. You just need to be a good person. He did seances and talked about reincarnation and talking with dead spirits and being a moral person and going back to nature. He had a whole different vibe here. This is a spiritualist.
Right? That sounds nothing like Mormonism. What?
No, he was. So he turned it down. He had to write a letter to Brigham saying, no, I'm not going to try to be in charge, because he was 27 at the time. He was very young.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to try to be the new boss of it. I'm just going to do my thing. And he goes, well, all right, go get the money from Sam Brannan. And eventually he gets some money. And that's at this time, something special happens. He founds the Mormon colony in San Bernardino. And this is New Zion. This is not Utah. This is the real spot right here, the special juice. Let's hit the next picture, and I'll explain it to you. Here's a layout, the plan of San Bernardino, based on this Egyptian grid system that Joseph was into, and that Brigham Young, Salt Lake City. It's a holograph of Salt Lake City, the San Bernardino fort. And Amasa bought this from the Lugo, from Don Lugo of Lugonia. It was called Lugonia at the time. These are ancient cities of California. Like
this is like a Spanish Don or something? Or?
Yeah, and this is a Spanish nobility. It deals with Juana Parcera, and white people come to California a lot. See, we talk about ancient pyramids in Egypt and all these other places we talk about, but California, there was nothing there. What, gold? Now, before that, there's lots of ancient ruins and ancient history that's not explored. And this is just the beginning of exploring this history. Because the Lugos and Juana Parcera and the Catholic Church already knew something was in California. They was already trying to get there and get something, special gold and ancient temples. You know, breakaway lost civilizations. David Hatcher Childress, Walter Bosley, there are two authors that go deep into this California stuff. And so Amasa finds this special land because it's fertile, it's perfect. There's hot springs, there's rivers, there's a giant arrowhead. Let's go to the next picture and I'll explain this, how special San Bernardino is. See that arrowhead on the mountain?
Yeah.
So before they built that hotel there with the healing springs and the Arrowhead hotel pool itself, that's where the Native Americans were. It was special. This is like ancient land. This is an ancient spot. Ancient.
Did they make
ancient
that?
History.
Is that a naturally occurring formation, or was that
naturally occurring formation? And at the bottom is these healing hot springs. And this is where you have Big Bear and a special part of California. It's a desert, but this part is nice. It's fertile. This is where the natives were. And this was where the Spaniards came and took them out. And then later on, this is the Mormon colony that Amasa bought from Don Lugo. And it's very special. Up into modern times, this little area of land, I don't know if it's getting loud right now. The gardener's here. For some reason, I switched the time and the gardener comes every single time. It deals with nature. We're cleaning house. We're cleaning the garden out with these videos. So that's symbolic of it. But at this hotel, you'd have Marilyn Monroe. In the area was Aleister Crowley, Parsons. Up to the left there was a lodge that Bugsy Siegel had. That it was a gambling lodge. Where LaVey, Anton LaVey was the busboy when he was 16, worked up there.
Holy
a lot of occulted history. Wyatt Earp eventually became the mayor of this. OK Corral, we know about that. What happened after that? He came here and became the mayor when he was looking for gold and aliens. There's a lot of occulted history in this area that just, like I said, Marilyn Monroe, Wyatt Earp, MK Ultra,
It all comes back to California with America. It
And
seems that
people don't
way.
know about this part. And see, when they founded the city, he did the loan through Rothschild Bank, which up to this day, hundreds of years later, did the bankruptcy because that little town is bankrupt. And it was bigger than Los Angeles. It was going to be such. Los Angeles is nothing compared to what was happening here. They had the first hydroelectric power and street lights and all kinds of shit going on. Well,
So
we'll show that
what
in next
happened?
videos. And they had the Zodiac Killer and all kinds of lots of stuff going on. Occulted histories with
Yeah.
California in this little area that the Mormons set up that they bought from the Spaniards who set it up that killed the Indians there. But Brigham didn't like that. They're out there suffering in the desert, and you got Amasa, Mason Lyman over here doing seances with Joseph Smith's widow in nice weather. And this is where they all wanted to go. This is where they originally were going to go. And Brigham said no. And he had what was called the Great Mormon Recall, where he sent them all home to Utah. You know, and what's funny, I talked about how Amasa got in trouble for his sermon in Scotland. He had to apologize to him once again. So many times does Amasa have to apologize to these guys. Like, oh, I'm sorry for doing that. I'm so sorry, because he's afraid of the Danites in Porter Rockwell and their assassins, you know, what they could do. Because eventually the people at this Mormon colony, and also the funny part about the Mormon fort, they had the first B'nai B'rith came there. The synagogue there, Katz set it up. And they had esoteric Jewish secret society there as well.
Oh, wow.
It gets deep. It gets deep. And then MK Ultra later at the VA hotel down the street, where they're doing a lot of research, where they killed so many Native Americans, and they were doing what's the word?
Euthanasia?
No, to make it so you can't have kids.
Oh, sterilization.
They were sterilizing Native American women up to thousands of them a year until at this hospital down the street from there, the sister hospital. What happened was a rich heiress sent her daughter there at like 14 to sterilize her so she wouldn't have kids because she's afraid she would get pregnant and the money would go out of the line. And so when she turned 18, she sued her mom and they shut down the hospital in the MK Ultra and the sterilization projects that were down the street. Wow. But the hospitals are still there. It's a lot of, it deals with Lugonia and these ancient cities. But, you know, so they tell them all come back to Utah. You guys got to come back because we're going to have a war because we want Deseret to pop off the beehive and they want to take over America. And this was going to be the choicest spot. They found New Zion, which people have been looking for thousands of years with gold and ancient structures right here with the healing waters.
Right. It's important, too, that we set the scene like you're saying, right? They got these connections. Okay, the Mormon church at this time has these extraordinarily powerful, rich connections in California. They own all of the Utah territory, right? Plus, Brigham Young has a constant stream of new converts who are pouring in from Europe. And when they arrive, many of them are giving away most of their funds to Brigham Young. We don't know how rich he was, but it is widely agreed that at this point, he was the single richest man in America, the single most powerful individual. The American government could not stand for this. This could not happen. You cannot have a king existing in America. Like, that was never going to fly with the vast majority of the Americans, you know?
Well, Sam Brannan would have taken him out. He had way more money than him. If it wasn't for Lola taking out Sam Brannan.
Right.
And Amasa afraid of the Danites, that he had to go back to Utah. And one of the things, Las Vegas was set up by them too.
Right.
Originally as a colony, as part of this trail going there.
Yep.
No, and they all had to go back there because they had to go fight.
This is the thing with Brigham Young when you study his history. He is the most powerful Mormon because he was the most ruthless and because he controlled the Danites and people like Porter Rockwell, you know? Like, it's wild. The stuff that they were doing, I remember watching a thing with Bryce Blakenagel where he was talking about how they looked into the populations of the Native Americans in Utah prior to Brigham Young and post Brigham Young, like the Mormon, in over 80% of them gone, you know, over 80% of them, of the indigenous people who lived in that area, gone, unaccounted for. Where did they go? You know?
Yeah. Well, it's a sad story. We'll get more into it in a second, but I'll finish off with Amasa. When
Right.
Amasa gets back to Utah, the Strangites want to promote him as the new leader once again.
After James dies? Oh my God.
Amasa, since day one, they knew he was going to be something special. He was always the threat to Brigham was Amasa because of his seances and spirituality. So when he comes back to Utah, once again, people side with Amasa's clique. And he's going to be the new leader. He's going to take over Utah until finally they get mad at him again. And they excommunicate him. They have to excommunicate him. But finally, Amasa gets reinstated after his death, posthumously, what it's called, by Joseph Francis Smith Jr., like the nephew of Joseph Smith, years later, because they're connected. He's like, nah, we're going to bring you back into the fold. You did nothing wrong. It was just Brigham's trickery. Because Brigham's a bad boy. Because if you go to the next picture, we're going to really bring it home on how the Native American connection and California and Utah. All right, so there was a party of folks that were going from east to California because of the gold rush. And Mormons in Utah as well were like, nah, we're going to the Arrowhead. We want to go where Amasa set up shop to this new Zion where we heard this beautiful land. You don't have to worry about Brigham trying to have sex with your daughters and your wife. They were trying to escape. Right. So they jump on with this wagon train headed for California, and it's called the Mountain Meadows Massacre. What happens is these Danites dress up as Indians, and they get some local Indians, and they massacre Mormons and a wagon train, women and children going to California, and just leave like 15, 17 people alive.
Wow.
Pisses off the government of America so much so when people find out that it wasn't natives. They tried to make it say it was like, oh, natives just massacred these people. But it was really Mormons dressed up as natives, massacring the Mormons that were trying to escape to California, to New Zion, the real Zion, not that hellhole in the desert.
Right. It's important that we stress, like, a lot of people may not understand, why would Brigham Young want to stay in Utah? Okay. So Utah at this time is not America, right? It's largely Mexico, but he doesn't give a shit. He just goes in and he took it for himself. He was trying to declare his own kingdom. And the rough isolation of that area, the desperation, all suited his needs. Everyone had to rely on him who went to Utah. Everyone. They were all connected. He controlled everything. He was just a megalomaniac, insane cult leader trying to exercise as much control over people as humanly possible. It's terrifying.
Next picture, please. That's the monument to the massacre, that stone mound right there. So that's up in the middle of the desert somewhere. And this is for the Mormons that were leaving Utah to go to the real New Zion, where they could do spirituality and be in good weather. And then have to have no one having sex with your wives or trying to get your daughters. And they lived in harmony with the Native Americans, and they had a Jewish synagogue that was part of the fort. It's a whole different vibe than what we see, what modern Mormonism and LDS has turned into. That's why they try to erase this. But they didn't kill him. They couldn't kill Amasa. He died he made it to like 70 something years old. And they have the Lymanites, and even his some of his kids were excommunicated too later on. They're cutthroat. It's very cutthroat. So at this time, unless you got any more politics or anything to say about it, we'll enter into a different part of Mormonism, which is into the sexual parts, the marriage ceremonies. So if there's anything else you'd like to bring up before we go there.
Yeah, I just want to highlight too, like, at this time we got to remember, right? Like, the Mormon Church is becoming this militarized entity, right? It's becoming this codified thing that it's taking on a whole new form, right? Like what you were describing there is that largely the early Mormon Church, it's very much a populist movement that's based around communal ideas and all this stuff. What we think of modern Mormonism doesn't really come to fruition until this time. And it's really a product of Brigham and his interpretation and reorganizing of everything, So.
Mm, mm. All righty, folks. Now you guys want to have some fun with this? We talked about the massacring natives and tricking people out of money with magic stones and wars and the gold rush and people fighting over who's the real prophet and all that. Now let's get into some of the workings, because we didn't get really into the spirituality of it. We'll talk about that in other episodes. What I want to get into here is what these elders are doing with this plural wife stuff and these sealing ceremonies and endowing ceremonies, and you have like 5 to 10 wives, and all your wives get married together, and so that you guys are married in outer space or whatever in perpetuity. The wives are sealed together, and they would cut. The knife was part of it in these ceremonies. We're going to learn the knife is part of the cutting and the sharing of the blood and wrapping. But go for it. Tell us something.
I want to give us a little bit of understanding of some Mormon theology, so we fully understand this, right? Like I was stating, Mormonism kind of evolves over time, and a lot of these ideas, especially the later, more controversial ideas, the ones that surround the Book of Abraham, and ones that come out of sort of the later polygamy era, are controversial because they were kept within the upper echelons and they were only reserved for elders, bishops, and the Danites largely. So it creates so much insane controversy. But we have to understand that Mormon theology by the time of Nauvoo takes a strong sort of evolutionary turn where all of a sudden it becomes about becoming a God figure. In the Book of Abraham, they really get into this. This isn't from the Book of Mormon directly. So in the Book of Mormon, we do have God as a physical man. You do have some of this physical stuff that later plays in, but we don't have this intense theology. What we get with the Book of Abraham is this old cosmology where there's this understanding that people are meant to imitate God. And if we are good enough people on this earth, that when we die, we get to gain our own star, our own planet. And all of the wives that we are endowed with, like this is only for men, by the way. Women are property in the system.
Only for white men. I forgot to say that. Mentioned.
Yeah, right. At this time, it's like Mormon acceptability, where for other colors comes later. They have this whole thing about the curse of Shem, and people who are brown skinned are evil, doomed by Satan, right? And one of the prophets later on has to come out and say, God changed his mind about that. There's no more brown skin curse. But
black money's good. Yeah, he liked that black money.
Right? They want to proselytize in Africa is what that's about. But where it gets wild is that there's this whole cosmology about this understanding that you get to inherit and create your own universe. If you're a good enough person, you get to become a God incarnate on your own planet, and that's what a lot of this is about, turning these Mormons into these God kings, these men with their harems that they get to rule in perpetuity in outer space. That's the dream, right? It sounds a lot like Scientology or some of the shit Crowley's talking about,
Right. It's funny you said outer space, because there was even a point where he talked about moon Quakers. He said that there was Quakers on the moon, and they were all 6 feet tall, and these white dudes, and they were living up on the moon. They're called moon Quakers. So this is a bathtub called the washing anointing ceremony. It's part of a washing ritual. So if you in your Mormon temples, you have a room that has a bathtub. And this is not for your normal, like at your house bathtub. This is for the washing ritual, which to some people today say they feel molested over this. People have sued over it. And in some temples, they got multiple rooms with these anointing bathtubs to do these anointing. You get naked and somebody got to do something, anoint you in certain body parts.
Wow.
It's called the washing ritual or anointing ritual. And it's because their view on sexuality is very strange, and this is not to be confused with soaking. Washing is different than soaking. Soaking, do you know what the soaking is?
So I've heard reference to this, and we're getting weird and sexual, but isn't soaking when they, you put your penis in the vagina kind of thing, but then there's no friction?
Don't move. Don't
No?
move. As long as you don't move, you're cool. You just put it in there and you just don't move. It's soaking in the juices. You still try not to move. God damn it. That's different than washing and anointing. That's called soaking. Now, so let's say y'all want to hook up. Let's hit the next picture. And you have to wear these underwear, these magic garments. They're magic undies to make sure, no. And I didn't.
Sorry, go ahead.
And I didn't talk about the 11th degree is acceptable to them because that's not going to get you pregnant, obviously.
Right. So yeah, for those who don't know, they're talking about anal sex, and this is something that a lot of Mormon teens engage in. Has become sort of a joke meme, on the modern internet. But a lot of this kind of magical underwear stuff, this is something that we see in many different religious communities, right? Yeah, I know the Mormons get made fun of for this often, but these weird kind of things around sexual propriety are very common. Like I think about the Sikhs, they have a special type of boxers that you're supposed to wear that you tie a knot. So the idea is that before you engage in sexual relations, you have to untie the knot and think about it.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like this, all of this weird sin reduction behavior. It's of that quality,
And so, part of them getting married in these different ceremonies, they use the word sealing. They have something called the endowment ceremony. Let's hit the next picture.
This sealing stuff gets wild because it doesn't have to just be sealing in this lifetime, right? Remember, we were just talking about how these people were said to get their own planets. So it could be sealing for, with your husband into their universe for in perpetuity. And this where it gets wild is like Joseph Smith, after he died, many people's wives were sealed to him. Many dead people were sealed to him, who never agreed to marry him, right?
and part of the ritual is this thing. They cut you above your knee during the endowment ceremony.
Yeah, what is going on there?
I don't know. We're still looking into that. We're going to talk about that in later episodes. I'm sure some of our Mormon friends will reach out to us who know more secrets about this, and
if you got
they were doing some wild stuff.
Yeah,
and like I said, they would cut the women's hands to the wives, and they would connect and seal like the blood bond,
right?
The blood oath. A lot of wild rituals that are very sexualized, and they may have been taking the wild lettuce and the henbanes and mandrakes and different things. We don't know. That's just like like you said, for the elites, for the upper echelon. Not the regular folks at the bottom don't know. They don't even know this is going on.
This is the thing. We're pretty certain that by the time that Smith is getting to Nauvoo, they're still doing these drug rites, but they're only for the Danites,
Yeah. But the sexual rites never ended. That's why they stayed in Utah. They figured it out. They're like, look at San Bernardino's cool. They have gold, good weather, healing hot springs. Everything's perfect. But they're going to be honest. If we stay in Utah, you could have as many wives as you want. You could do what you want. You get them in the washing ceremony, the anointing ceremony, the sealing ceremony, the endowment ceremony. Let's hit the next pick.
Yeah.
Which is something that's famous in these temples. I want to show you.
Is that a bed?
Yeah, it's a bed. That's a bed. And you could type in these beds. They got a lot of these beds for the marriage ceremony. in the
Wow.
temple. And some of them, there's chairs around it where people watch. All the elders are watching.
That's so creepy.
Oh yeah, they had to pass laws to try to ban this. People but if you have your own state, as in Utah, well then that's why certain laws didn't even get changed up until the 90s or 2000s even. Some of their
Right.
silly laws that were on the books there.
Well, it's one of these, it's kind of like an open secret. Like if you go to Utah today, if you know who to talk to, and these people trust you, you will probably, I'm certain, find thousands of polygamous couples, if not tens of hundreds of thousands of polygamous couples. Even though this is no longer mainstream Mormon ideology in this life, it's still mainstream Mormon ideology in the next life, right? They've never really gotten rid of polygamy. It's still essential to modern LDS church. It's just transformed, and it's been removed from the public eye. Like one of the interesting things I've always felt about the LDS church, like Brigham Young's church, is that they managed to do something that a lot of churches wish they could, and that is become a global enterprise corporation. They don't just have their own country. Like that was Brigham Young's dream, was to have a country. But the Mormons that came
Corporations more
after him,
powerful. Corporations more powerful. Get your
they
tax breaks,
incorporated.
and they got their people up in the government there. Like there was so much. It took so much legal activism just to get black folks up in the church, just to get women and black people's role in Mormonism says a lot.
Oh yeah, and now we're
It's
seeing
just,
ongoing.
Angel Morani in that story is so powerful that they accept.
Right, and it's the Mormon Church wields so much power in Utah and California too, right? Like I remember reading about back in the day. Do you remember Proposition 8 in California when they were legalizing homosexual marriage? And I remember them reading these stories about how the Mormon Church was paying millions of dollars to bring buses out to these Catholic communities, these Spanish communities, and bring in all of these people to go vote against Proposition 8 to ensure that they could fight against homosexuality. Like, wild.
Well, it was the Mormons coming to San Francisco that made it a city to begin with. Part of it. It was a small little town before the whole Mormon colony set up shop there.
Right.
They double tripled the economy and the people. San Francisco was a big giant. So there's a lot of history that's gone. LDS just wants to get rid of all this stuff and just make it a modern. They try to tame it down. They try to tame down the masonry, the spiritualism. They try to make it seem like it's more of an actual Christian religion.
Yeah, well, this has been
which it's not. It's not a Christian religion. Don't get fooled into that. But they want to like, oh no, we're just like a denomination, like Catholic, Protestant, Mormonism.
I remember, like, this was something that was so wild to me as like an outsider to American politics, was when Mitt Romney managed to get the nomination for the Republicans, a Mexican Mormon, right? Like, I understand he had all of the right talking points, but there was a point in American history where that would never have bloody happened. But you're right. There's been this whole propaganda shift where Mormonism, especially the LDS version and the RLDS versions, have become mainstream acceptable within American society.
Well, you're talking about the Mexican colony down there with the Foxes as well. In the Romneys. They got into trouble with the cartel, shot them up. They said, F off. We ain't going for your bullshit. Cartels don't give no, they give no fucks. They come with the chainsaws and cut it off heads. Nobody cared, So, but they're still there trying to exploit Mexico.
Yeah, right.
They got a bunch of Mexican plural wives.
Who knows what these people get up to in their compounds? This is the thing, right? Like, if they were keeping all this shit secret back then, what are they keeping secret now? They still got profits,
They had to, like right here, they had to investigate it. They sent the cops there to say, hey, why do you have beds in here? And like, what are you guys doing? What does this have to, what are you doing? Right. No, well, you just don't understand, brother.
And there's so much sketchy shit. I remember reading too, like, the Mormon church, the modern LDS church, has the largest food storage of any corporation on earth. They're storing billions of tons of grain for when the end times come.
And you know what's ironic too? You know where the most porn hits come out of on the internet, the IP addresses? Through Utah.
Yeah.
That's where in the United States, the most watched porn is there.
This is a classic normal thing, you know, when you persecute people and you deny people stuff, then they freak out about it and they become bloody weird. You know, it's like a trope we see time and time again. Like, I just a little bit off topic, but like we legalized marijuana a couple of years ago in Canada, and you know, everyone we saw this spike when it was first legalized, and now we're seeing this drop off to lower than even before legalization for in terms of people using. And this is how it generally always goes, because once things become acceptable and normalized, only the people who really want to do it will do it, you know? Right. Or people will do it on occasion when they feel like it and they don't obsess over it, you know?
Well, you know, at this time, got to tell you all, like, subscribe. We're going to need some comments on this. We want the Mormon homies to reach out to us and tell us your experiences on this and share. And we're going to have more episodes on this. This is just the start of it, you know, and join us. We have more stuff coming up, more juicy stuff coming soon. So check in, get ready. We're barely getting started.
Yeah, we wanted to give you kind of an overview of some of the crazy stuff. And now our next episodes, we're going to go a little bit more in depth and provide you some of the juicy kind of crazy stories that we see within, you know, Mormonism and in early American religion in general. But yeah, like and subscribe. Please comment. You know, the algorithm doesn't support us. We don't get monetized. You know, I've been trying to get monetized, but YouTube keeps saying no. Our content is too radical. So please support us. Give us some love. And tune in next week for part 2, where we get even more freaky with the Mormons.
All right. Have a blessed week.
All right. Peace and love. Hail Satan. Take care, my friends.